Let's go on a quest. After all, we are adventuring, rootin' tootin' space cowboy protectors of the realm. And therefore we must go out and kill 4 of these mammoth things because some guy is paying us for their meat. If this kind of thing sounds familiar, it's because you've played an MMORPG sometime in the last, 10 years. Ever since World of Warcraft conquered the MMORPG market and condemned us all to 10 years of by-the-numbers theme park games, we've basically been doing the same quests. Kill a bunch of dudes, collect some stuff, deliver a letter to another friggin' continent, escort some dumb douchebag, or some wonderful combination of the above. And while we absolutely cannot attribute the invention of questing to World of Warcraft, we can absolutely blame it for the manifestation of questing in basically every MMORPG since. But what is it about questing that makes it so ubiquitous, that was so important about it that the original World of Warcraft put it on the back of the box? Seriously. What makes some games do it really well, and some games do it not so well, despite the fact that they are functionally doing the same thing? And how do we innovate ourselves out of it? Well, it will be our quest today on MMOTalk to figure it out. So where the hell does questing come from? Well, I don't know, probably Dungeons and Dragons or some shit. The problem with a lot of video gaming history is sources for some of these conventions, which today seem so natural, why wouldn't you have them in a game, are kind of difficult to track down. That said, we could usually probably just say Dungeons and Dragons, being that the entirety of Dungeons and Dragons was based on what would eventually form the foundation for video game storytelling. But when it comes to MMORPGs, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because we're talking about a specific type of storytelling: questing. Before World of Warcraft kind of standardized what today we consider standard questing procedure, a lot of MMORPG character progression came down to killing monsters in the wild. You'd often find yourself grinding mobs in order to get either equipment or levels or experience or whatever it was you were looking for. Now, while this had its advantages in that you're probably doing it with a group of friends from your guild or just a group in the world, you're meeting people, you're hanging out, you're talking, you're enjoying yourself, and you're getting some pretty sweet rewards while you do it, this also sounds incredibly boring and like grind. And trust me, while it was super fun and had its moments, it mostly was just a grind. Enter World of Warcraft around 2004, what I consider to be the beginning of the 3rd generation of MMORPGs. So World of Warcraft came into the market with this idea of creating an accessible MMORPG, and one of the things it needed to do in order to create accessibility was create a system of breadcrumbing, so players always knew what to do. World of Warcraft accomplished this through their questing system, something that was actually innovative at the time. I know it's hard to believe, so much so that they did put it on the back of the box. And while World of Warcraft's questing was incredibly Spartan compared to today's standards, it was completely and utterly a game changer. I do not think that it is a stretch to say that World of Warcraft would have been nowhere near the enormous smash hit that it was if it hadn't have standardized questing to such a degree. While there were still certainly opportunities to grind and advance your character through just killing monsters in the world, and at higher levels this may have even been more efficient, there's absolutely zero doubt in my mind that what led to World of Warcraft's success was the prevalence of questing as the primary mechanic of advancement for about 30 or 40 levels. People fucking loved it. Experienced MMORPGs players came into this and saw that the world had more context and was therefore more fun, and new people who had never played an MMORPG in their lives were able to access content a lot more readily instead of having to find farming groups and grinding mobs. And thus, the modern MMORPG quest was born. Almost every game that followed World of Warcraft into the MMORPG space adopted this form of questing, from Dungeons and Dragons Online and Lord of the Rings Online, games like Star Wars The Old Republic, all the way up to WildStar and modern MMOs. And that's probably because this system of questing is so goddamn flexible it fits everywhere. From leveling up your character to endgame daily questing to story hubs to PvP, questing in this style can fit into every single section of an MMORPG. It's so ubiquitous that nowadays it's taken for granted that an MMORPG will have quests. The system is deceptively simple. There are 5 general types of quests you will really experience in most MMORPGs. That would be a kill quest, which is basically exactly what it sounds like, a gathering quest, also exactly what it sounds like, a delivery quest, which usually involves you wandering to the other side of a planet to deliver a letter, an escort quest, which involves you escorting somebody somewhere and usually involves you protecting them, and then a hybrid of these other 4. So you can have an escort kill quest where you escort somebody to a boss, or you can have a kill collect quest where you have to collect items from things you kill. It's all pretty basic. Those 5 questing styles cover basically everything in most modern MMORPGs. There are some really notable exceptions, like the Secret World's investigation quests, which involve you sussing out in-game conspiracy theories using actual internet or other sources, which are probably some of the coolest quests I've ever done in an MMO. But for the most part, those 5 questing styles cover everything. Generally, you acquire this quest through some means, complete it, and then turn it in for a reward. It's a very simple and flexible system. They can deliver narrative, they can deliver content, they can deliver basically everything an MMORPG has to offer. They act effectively as breadcrumbs leading players around and add a sort of stable linearity to a non-linear medium. Basically, the questing system that World of Warcraft popularized is, in theory, friggin' brilliant. So why is it that some people hate the crap out of questing? Quests are essentially just another grind. You're taking the original grind that was killing hundreds of monsters and instead imposing it into the restrictive structures of quests, which gives them context, but is essentially exactly the same thing you were doing before. Which leads to the question, what makes questing better than grinding if they're both just essentially a grind? Well, questing adds 2 things to the grinding system of MMORPGs that is incredibly important. Number 1 is context. Number 2 is agency. So let's talk about these 2 concepts for a bit before I go into some examples. First of all, context. Context is the reason why you're doing something. Now previously, and most people even still do this, the only reason you do these grinds is to increase the bar at the bottom or top of the screen in order to make it hit arbitrary levels so that you can gain a power boost. Now you have a context on top of that context. With quests, you have stories or interesting things about the world. You have reasons to be doing something. For example, normally you would just go kill 10 enemies in a field to level up. But a quest gives you the opportunity to kill 10 things in a field for a reason and potentially an additional reward. Farmer Joe needs you to kill these 10 things in this field, and in return will provide you with a pair of pants and maybe enough experience to level up. While otherwise you would just go into the field and kill the 10 things anyway, with a small chance of getting those pants and probably enough experience to level up as well. But because there's actual context, there's a reason Farmer Joe needs us to do this as opposed to we just going to do it ourselves, we feel more driven to do it. It's almost a subconscious trigger. You feel that direction gives you a lot more incentive to actually complete it, even over and above the incentive you were receiving anyways. That context, whether it's the narrative context of Farmer Joe and his field, or that context of the structure of the quest itself, knowing that there is a structure there providing you with direction, gives you more incentive and makes you feel better about completing said quest. You can arguably apply this same logic to the reason why a lot of people leveling in low-level areas of World of Warcraft prefer dungeon spam to questing, because dungeons provide even more context, whether it's in the structure of the dungeon's narrative or in the structure of the dungeon itself, that encourages more people to do them. In essence, a dungeon grind in World of Warcraft is similar to questing grind in that there is a structure there. You complete a number of predetermined objectives within the dungeon, boss fights, and at the end you often receive a reward, which is some extra experience and maybe a satchel depending on if you did a random. That structure, whether it's in a dungeon grind or in a quest, gives us context. Even if we don't think about it, that context is there, and therefore you're more willing and more incentivized to complete them. On the other hand, quests also offer us something called agency. Now, I've harped on agency a lot in the past, because I honestly believe that agency is the single most powerful driving force in video games. That includes MMORPGs. Agency is essentially the player's ability to affect how they progress, or how they do things, or the world itself. It is essentially their ability to choose how they play the game. And that's super important, especially in questing. While questing is often seen as structured and rigid, there's a little bit more agency in it than most people give it credit for. Despite the fact that these quest chains are still just essentially linear lines, you get to choose how you approach the quests, what order you do them in, even what hubs you want to work out of, and sometimes what zones you want to work out of. But this is all a lot of nice talk and stuff, but let's see some of these ideas in action. So WildStar is a game that I love. but whose questing has always irked me, like, a lot. But I've never been able to quite put my finger on why I didn't enjoy it as much as I did other games, despite the fact it is essentially the same questing system that basically every other modern MMORPG utilizes. But when you take these two ideas of context and agency and you apply them to WildStar, you start to see why the questing in WildStar has been described as probably its weakest aspect. Context is a huge driver of motivation for me when it comes to MMORPG questing, and WildStar has got context in spades. It's dripping with story and reasons to do things. My problem is that, with a couple of notable exceptions throughout the game, most of this context and story is completely disconnected from the actual questing itself. Sadly, because all of this context is disconnected from the questing experience and hidden throughout the world in things like data cubes or journals, you kind of get to this point where you can ignore a lot of the context. And in fact, it's easier to ignore the context than to embrace it. One thing I find myself doing in WildStar when I'm questing is getting into this groove where I'm just going through the motions. I'm picking up quests, I'm completing quests, I'm coming back. I'm not really acknowledging the stories of those quests, because the story and the lore of WildStar seem so disconnected from them. A good example of this disconnected feeling is White Veil. You've got a lot of stuff going on that's really interesting, but none of it seems to be held consistently through the zone, so you find yourself losing interest. You've got stuff like the Ascendancy Cult, you've got the Hydrus Protocols, you've got a double agent in Themrock if you're in exile. There's all sorts of cool stuff going on, but because the game kind of shunts you from one story to the next without ever really continuing or finishing any of them, you find yourself disinterested. The context just isn't there. This holds a stark contrast to another modern MMORPG, which uses an almost identical questing system, Final Fantasy XIV. I like to think of Final Fantasy XIV as the king of context, because the entire game sticks to a theme and a through line and a narrative, which keeps people playing. From level 1 all the way to max level, you always have a main story quest to follow, and it's always connected to what's occurring directly to you, to the characters that you're meeting, and to the zones that you're playing through. This main story quest acts as a guide and a contextual center for the entire questing experience. This has the massive drawback of being incredibly restrictive to the point of entirely frustrating, but it also provides you with a really interesting story and basis for what you're doing. It feels better than WildStar, despite it being incredibly restrictive, simply because you've got that context, that story, that narrative to keep you going. It gets into you and you feel the need to keep questing for it. Hell, Final Fantasy XIV shows the difference between having context to your actions and not having context to your actions within its own questing structure. The first 20 or so levels of Final Fantasy XIV's questing are largely a tutorial, which means that you're kind of doing quests that don't really feel like they have very much context to them, because you're moving between quests that aren't necessarily related to each other to teach you different concepts. And this is the weakest part of Final Fantasy's questing, the part where most people quit and dislike it. Around level 25 or so, you start getting into the real narrative meat of the game, and suddenly you feel a lot more connected to it. You feel a lot more driven to complete it. This is what I've heard countless times from people who hate questing on like a primal level. They find it much more enjoyable once they hit that 20th level and reach that interesting story. Because all of that context in WildStar is spread out throughout the world as explorable objectives, you find yourself much less connected to the questing itself. I find myself much more connected to the world, but much less connected to doing things in it that I'm told to do. The questing is boring because it doesn't include any of this context. It's just questing for questing's sake. What about agency in questing and agency in WildStar? You see a lot of this at the beginning of WildStar, and it starts really strong. You have an option of 4 different zones based on your faction to go to, and these lead into 4 more zones, which you can swap between. And this feels great. You have a lot of choice in where you want to go and how you pursue questing. But as you level up through WildStar's different zones, you find your choices being restricted further and further. By the time you hit White Veil, that's the only zone available to you, although it's still fairly open. But once you hit Farside, you find yourself in a linear progression even of quest hubs, unable to really jump to the next hub if you want to. Though you can still skip zones, you can't really skip the linearity of those zones, which feels really crappy. You can jump onto your own initiative and find really cool things out in the world. there's a lot of explorable agency to be had, but none of it is tied directly to questing. None of it's tied directly even to your own primary character advancement. So you find yourself just finding these things on your own initiative, but the questing itself still feels linear and painful. Let's compare this to another MMORPG that does agency incredibly well. Another one of NCSoft's games, Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 is the king of agency in how you progress. You can pick whatever zone you want, you can progress through that zone however you feel like, going to hearts, going to different points of interest, such as viewpoints or just, I guess, points of interest. Guild Wars 2 does have a classical story quest, but most of your questing is actually done in the mapping system, which encourages you to explore regions and find objectives for yourself, as opposed to being told where to go. You can jump between questing hubs, you can jump between entire zones, you can go back to previous zones you haven't completed yet. All of it syncs, so you can just do it in whatever order you feel like. There is so much freedom in how you pursue questing in Guild Wars, it's mind-boggling. Sadly, Guild Wars lacks a lot of context, and therefore you can find yourself lost and completely unsure of what to do. But to some people, this is awesome. Being able to get lost in a world and just explore and do whatever you want is great. Other people need that breadcrumb trail to follow, and that's fine too. But sadly, WildStar's questing bridge doesn't quite work this way. It just gets narrower and narrower until you're stuck in linear hub-to-hub questing with no real room to explore and do things on your own, in terms of questing, that is. So where does this all leave us? I've given you some examples, I've broken down the idea of context and agency. How do we take these and apply it to a new system? How do we innovate on these ideas to make questing even more awesome? Well, someone's already beaten us to the punch. And please say it wasn't Blizzard. Please say it wasn't Blizzard. God damn it, it was Blizzard. Blizzard Entertainment has released Legion, and that has completely, once again, reworked how questing works in MMORPGs. They've taken a lot of ideas from both Final Fantasy XIV and Guild Wars 2 to apply them to create really fun questing. You've got deep contextual storytelling and theming from Final Fantasy, and this sort of open world questing system that unlocks at max level, which rings true of Guild Wars events and hearts. It just feels really cool. As usual, leave it to World of Warcraft to take good ideas from their competitors and melt them down into Azeroth's own weird smoothie. And the absolute cherry on top of this is Suramar, a zone designed entirely to embrace these two concepts of context and agency to the absolute maximum degree. Some of you might have done some of it, some of you might not. It doesn't matter. I'm gonna try and avoid spoiling some of it, but it's fantastic. But imagine an MMORPG that completely embraced the Suramar model and built its entire storyline and its entire questing experience around it. Imagine an entire World of Warcraft expansion, or Final Fantasy expansion, or Guild Wars expansion, built not just around one of the concepts, but both context and agency in its questing. You might actually find yourself having a lot of fun questing. And who knows, one day they might even start feeling like adventures. Why, hello there, and thank you very much for watching this video on questing in MMORPGs. Such a controversial topic because nobody ever wants to quest because it takes for fucking ever. But I hope you've enjoyed this video, hopefully a little bit more than you've enjoyed questing. If you did, please do like and subscribe. It's a huge support to the channel. And if you have something you want to say about questing, throw one down in the comments and I will try and comment back as quickly as I can, and we can talk about quests. This whole video is brought to you by my awesome Discord server filled with awesome people. It's our little group Discord that we play games like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, and other stuff like Duck Game in. And it's open to anybody, and we only have one rule: just don't be a dick. You can find info on that in the channel description and in the video description. So join up if you want to hang out with some people who like to play video games. But other than that, thank you very much for watching this Orange Hatter video. It makes me so happy that you guys enjoy these, and you all continue to have a great one.